Our first guest is Craig Ross, Associate Director of the Built Environment at RICS. Craig consults at government level on resilience, fire safety, design, and construction. He is a chartered building surveyor with over 23 years of experience in the UK and Middle East. Craig now works globally to provide strategic advice to the industry. He has been heavily involved in fire safety issues, both in UK and UAE, leading several initiatives to reform regulatory processes and promote best practices. Craig, thank you so much for joining us today, and I'll hand it over to you for your presentation.
Thanks, Lynette. So hello to you all from London on a typically cloudy and rainy morning. So I hope that you're all well, and it's a real pleasure to be working with the Property Finder team once again. So thank you very much for that introduction, Lynette. Let's go straight onto the first slide, please. So I'm guessing that you may recognise RICS through the valuation side of chartered surveying, and although you should probably never start a presentation with a confession, I would point out from the bat that although I work for RICS, I'm a chartered surveyor, I don't actually come from a real estate background. I've never practiced the dark arts of valuation. I've come from very much a technical consultancy background. So when I scoped out the presentation with the team at Property Finder and discussed what you as the audience might be interested in that I could come and speak about, there seemed to be three things that would be most relevant, and conveniently these all start with C. So cladding, specifically the combustible type, climate change, and COVID-19. So we've only got 15-20 minutes or so to go through these, so it's really just going to be a quick overview. I'll try to use some examples from the other regions that we're working in to demonstrate why these things are definitely worth your consideration in the UAE just now, with the overall aim of raising your awareness. So on to the next slide, please. Okay, so let's skip on to the next one as well, thanks. That's it. So just as a bit of background, so these days RICS is a fairly global organisation. We've got a royal charter, which means that we have to act primarily in the public interest. So with these kind of macro risks that we're going to talk about, my department has to consider these from both a global and a local perspective, depending on where they occur. So if you're thinking, okay, Craig's from a technical background, he doesn't get involved in valuation, I'm not too sure of the relevance here. The first thing I would ask you to do is consider this diagram and the sort of different levels and different events in industry and how they affect us at different times. And this depends very much upon the scale of the event, the initial location, the reaction to the event, and your own personal proximity to it. So although some of these waves may not affect you immediately, you can be sure that the repercussions of these three risks will definitely be felt in due course. So next slide, please. Okay, so the first C is cladding. And both the UAE and the UK have some well-publicised fires, and I've used the address here not because it was the biggest in terms of size of fire or reform in the UAE, which was arguably Tamil for me, but because this is one of the most publicised, so all over the TV and social media around the world, because it was at New Year and everybody was tuning in to see the Burj Khalifa fireworks display. So we've also had a fire that shared some similarities in the UK, Grenfell, that you're very likely to have heard of because it was very well publicised and had a very similar issue with cladding that was combustible, as you can see. The big difference in the UK, however, was the death rate, 72 dead, and the government had absolutely no choice but to do something, and rightly so, and it's taken up a lot of focus across industry since Grenfell. But the thing I think is worth discussing with you today specifically is the effect on value of other properties with potential cladding issues. So on to the next slide, please. So after Grenfell, there was a lot of investigation into how this could happen, what we could do to change this. And it's just over 3 years since Grenfell, so the 14th of June there was the 3rd year anniversary, and this work is still ongoing. So taking a look back, shortly after Grenfell, the UK government launched what they called the Building Safety Programme, and eventually imposed a ban on combustible cladding over 18 metres for new builds. So in addition, existing buildings over 18 metres, only 6 stories, with combustible cladding, they were all identified, and cladding programme for removal. Now, the significant thing about this was that private buildings required private funding. And the typical cost, the estimates that we hear around about £1.6 million per building, which is roughly about sort of 7.5 million dirhams, and that's only for 6 stories. And eventually the government had to announce a fund that private owners could apply for. So this was initially set at around £200 million, and it's now been increased to 1 billion, or roughly 4.5 billion dirhams, and that's still estimated not to be enough for the complete extent of cladding remediation. So next slide, please. So as investigations continued, we found that cladding matters only seemed to get worse. So other materials were found to have issues, for example, HPL, which is called high pressure laminates. Different types of external wall insulation, different composite materials have been found to be combustible to certain degrees, and any fire these days is very well scrutinised in the media, and that's including fires below 18 metres. So this resulted in the UK government expert advisory panel recommending that external fire spread is managed and on buildings regardless of height. So all of a sudden that brought into the problem an influx of other buildings that we had to start considering. So it also exacerbated a very specific issue, and really the point I want to make today is that where there's a risk of combustible cladding, it's just a risk, so, or no evidence to prove that it's combustible or not, the valuers in this case had no choice but to assign a zero value to the property. Now that doesn't mean that the property has no value. Of course it still retains a value, but it's a mechanism for highlighting to the lender and the buyer that there's a risk that the valuer can't really define. So the long and short of this is that thousands of people have been left with property they can't sell, and you see these kind of headlines that are fairly consistent since this problem started in the UK media. Something that's also been very well publicised, protests about it. A lot of people are in a very difficult position. So next slide, please. Okay, so that's the UK. What about the UAE? Well, there's difference in regulations in the UAE. There's differences when it comes to sprinklers being fitted and other factors that have assisted in keeping the death rate with fires in the UAE, far lower. But there are very similar issues with the cladding. So the UAE, as you probably know, imposed their own ban on combustible cladding after Tamweel. But buildings built before 2012 still have the potential for cladding that's highly combustible. And like in the UK, having completion certificate, so something that proves that you got your DM approval and adherence with building codes, one of the assumptions that valuers will use is no longer a guarantee of adherence with building codes. And we find that although a completion certificate is present, you often have issues with cladding that's of no fault of DM or the municipality, for example. So at this point, I'll shamelessly plug the journal I edit, which is free to download, where in March we considered this very subject, and an old colleague of mine, Nick Constantine, wrote a very good summary article on fires in the UAE. So, as far as I understand, the last significant cladding fire in the UAE was in May. It was at Abco Tower in Sharjah. And I was reading the National, which said, I'll read verbatim. Sheikh Dr. Sultan bin Mohammed Al Qasimi, ruler of Sharjah, has directed officials to review and replace aluminium composite panel cladding to ensure the safety of residents. He did not state how the work would be paid for, however, but that many owners have responded already. And I'm not too sure what that means, but using the UK as an example, you can see where this has the potential to go, and why I would certainly classify cladding as a significant risk. Medium likelihood, but definitely the potential for a high impact. And I think the catalyst to look out for would be another cladding fire in the UAE. So on to the next slide, please. Okay, so the next C, climate change. So apart from the odd climate change denier, and some of them still exist, I think we've all woken up to the fact that climate change is real, and the UAE, as well as many other countries, has a significant vulnerability to this, as the statement here from the UAE government portal shows you. So the building stock is one of the main offenders, the existing building stock, generally accounting for around 40% of energy-related CO2 emissions on a country-by-country basis. Now that's slightly higher in the UAE for reasons we'll come into. And the UAE government's well aware of this and have set various incentives. For example, the UAE Energy Plan 2050, they've got plans to invest 600 billion dirhams in sustainability. The Dubai Integrated Energy Standard for 2030, which aims to reduce total energy consumption of both water and electricity by 30% by 2030, which isn't that far away. So next slide, please. Okay, so what does this really mean then, and how do we address it? Well, in new builds, this is very easy. You simply go ahead and change the regulations, and new builds have to comply. But that only accounts for 1 to 2% of buildings per annum. And that could potentially slow down. So the vast problem is for existing buildings, and indeed the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change (IPCC) 2018 report very firmly stated that building renovation is critical to achieving climate change targets. So to understand how this impacts industry, we held two what we call leaders forums last year, one in London, one in Dubai, with a mix of experts and practitioners to understand the challenges in these different regions of different climates. So in the UK, obviously, we have to heat our buildings. In Dubai, you've got to cool them. And some very interesting points came up. So the first thing to note is that a requirement for thermal insulation in Dubai was only enforced in 2003. So many buildings built before then have either limited or no thermal insulation, and that's one of the main reasons why I mentioned the building stock in Dubai accounts for more CO2 emissions than other comparable countries. In the UK, for example, it was 1976 that we enforced insulation. So there's also a push for what you probably heard as net zero, with the World Green Building Council leading the calls for countries and companies to sign up to this initiative. And to reach net zero, you either have to generate 100% of renewable energy on site, which is unlikely, let's face it, or you have to have a decent renewable energy source and a fairly energy efficient property. Which is far more likely. So it was also established that energy costs are likely to increase. I think we've may have seen that over time. But there is a significant potential to improve the energy efficiency of property in the UAE to counter this. Just as a brief example of this, if you take your average pre-2003 villa and you bring that up to a 1 Pearl STDAMA rating, which is the Abu Dhabi energy comparison, then you're looking at around about 35% in energy savings, which is considerable. And there are funding mechanisms out there. One of the things that's got a good potential in the UAE and Dubai, especially, I think, is the ESCO firms, the energy savings companies, who can organise. They can pay for and install the energy efficiency measures, and then payments for that are made through the savings in your energy bill. Surprisingly, uptake for that has been fairly slow. Okay, so on to the next slide, please. So the problem is, how do we encourage people to make these changes in their properties? The anecdotal evidence always suggests that if people are not really incentivized, they're more likely to spend their expendable cash on something else, a new kitchen or an extension or something that will definitely add value to their property. And according to this Gulf News article, this is something the Dubai Supreme Council of Energy are very aware of, and they had aimed to implement an energy rating system with the hope of emphasising the value of more energy efficient assets. So if you take two comparable buildings, one of them is more energy efficient, theoretically it should hold more value. And at this point, I'll shamelessly plug another RICS paper, the insight paper we produced on energy efficiency and value. We found that the energy efficiency is beginning to impact value of property, although this remains small at present in relation to traditional value drivers. But they concluded that moving forward, energy efficiency is likely to be of increasing importance in owner-occupied and investor-owner decisions, including those relating to lending and mortgages, and this will be reflected more clearly in property values. So this is also being promoted now in a publication you've heard of, what we call the Red Book, which is by its proper title, the RICS Valuation Global Standards, called the Red Book because it's always been read. Which now recognises this growing relevance of sustainability factors as a market influence and emphasises the importance of discussing sustainability when valuing interests in real estate value. So next slide, please. Okay, so the final C, and something that's probably no surprise to anybody listening today, COVID-19. So although I've been a little sneaky here, it's not so much COVID-19, but the economic fallout because of it that is more of a concern, because what started out as a health crisis is obviously definitely becoming more of an economic crisis now. Countries obviously dealt with this in different ways. So the UK, for example, was very quick to shut down construction sites. The UAE went on and continued building, albeit with certain restrictions. And the valuation market in the UK also slowed considerably because people couldn't move into new property, and some of the larger valuation firms had to furlough, which is it's a government scheme for helping firms that are struggling. A lot of them had to furlough up to 80 and 90% of their staff, so real issues at that time. And as a result, our strategic focus at RICS made a very quick shift. So it went from the traditional focus that we had into how can we instantly assist in facilitating a speedy return to construction and real estate industries. And we worked on various initiatives with industry partners to assist that process. But now that we're getting back to work, and we're entering what we call the reset phase of recovery. So the Construction Leadership Council has got a 3-stage plan. So restart, which we've really done, reset, so that's looking at new ways of working, and then reinvent. It means we'll all have to consider these new ways of working and figure out what this really means to us in reality in our industry subsectors. So the long and short is that construction and real estate is undoubtedly going to be affected. You will have seen the market economic forecasts, no doubt. I mean, the IMF one here consider this will all be more significant than the 2008 financial crash, which is obviously a concern. So next slide, please. Okay, so what might this mean for industry? Is it all doom and gloom? Well, probably not, but we are likely to see a slow in liquidity, which means a slow in construction, which means a strained supply chain, which for me indicates an increased risk in new build. And the so what's of that, and indeed the other points in this presentation, we're likely to see more of an interest in the existing stock, more wanting to buy existing buildings as opposed to risky new build, more wanting to stay and develop their property perhaps, more refurbishment, more extension and so on. So it's probably a good idea to review what happened in the previous crash and look at how certain industry sectors reacted. In the academic paper, hopefully you can see in the small print there, it's very interesting as it shows the potential for increase in sustainability sectors after the previous crash. And that's based upon what we've just discussed, that's also likely to increase significantly. So I also think there's going to be a demand for better building management. And this is already starting to come into action in the UAE or Dubai, certainly through the new GLP law, as well as calls for improvements in energy expenditure in jointly owned properties. And finally, anybody looking to take on an existing asset should certainly want to see a sound technical appraisal to understand the building fully and what the long-term technical and financial implications are. And that's a process we call technical due diligence, and that's a guidance note that we've updated from the first edition at the start of this year. So ultimately, as things change, you're likely to be thinking very carefully about your risk profile and very carefully about what these existing assets have in store. So next slide, please. Okay, so that concludes things. So we've looked at climate, cladding, and COVID-19. I hope that's been useful. It's a very quick look at them all. But now that we have some awareness of these risks, then we consider what to do about that. And it's probably best not to sit back and hope for the best. I like to finish presentations with an interesting quote. And this one from Rudy Giuliani, I think, is quite fitting. So he said that change is not a destination, just as hope is not a strategy. And hope is certainly not a strategy in this case. So thank you very much. That's me.
Thank you for the presentation, Craig. It was amazing insights, and thank you so much for discussing how things are in UAE and Dubai. So we already have a few questions for you, Craig. You have highlighted the potential risk of cladding. How can we, our clients, reduce risk when it comes to cladding in Dubai?
Okay, good question. I guess so. For me, to some extent, this depends on the building type, the building ownership, who's responsible for managing it. I guess because you need to understand exactly what type of cladding there is. Now that means checking as-built information on the property if you have it, and who's to say that's going to be completely accurate. And so initially, that may need another form of inspection, to understand exactly what the cladding type is. The reason being, as I mentioned before, just because you've got a completion certificate is no guarantee that the building will be compliant with the regulations. Well, certainly not current regulations or the regulations at the time the building was built. And the way you get about that is sometimes to have an inspection of the cladding or to actually go ahead and test it. And there's testing labs in Dubai, like the Thomas Bell Wright, I think, lab are a world-renowned testing facility where they test different cladding types before they're fitted to high-rise buildings, for example. So the first step is really understanding what you're dealing with, what the nature of the problem is. Is it definitely combustible cladding? Is there an issue behind the cladding? And don't get focused on the cladding itself. I don't think there's many other issues out there that can be a significant fire risk. For example, compartmentation between jointly owned properties, fire doors, fire systems working properly, and having a proper fire risk assessment, I think, is probably the first stage to understanding that.
Okay, thank you, Craig. Next question. How did the UK housing market deal with the cladding problem?
Well, it's still ongoing, as we've kind of touched on. But as soon as these zero value issues came to light, the Ministry of Housing, Communities, Local Government, the government departments that's been dealing with this specifically, came to RICS and various other industry players and said, look, we need a way of alleviating this problem that's jamming up the system. And they were very keen for us to be involved. So we sat down with UK Finance, represent the UK financiers, the Building Societies Association, and various other experts, so fire engineers and so on, to come up with some solutions. And what was decided was a form called EWS1, which is aimed at being a mechanism to confirm if the property has combustible cladding or not. So when the valuer goes to the property, if they're unsure, they can commission an EWS1 form, and an expert will fill that form in and say, yep, we're happy this property does not have combustible cladding, or yeah, we think that we in our professional opinion it does. Now this was originally set for buildings over 18 metres, and then, like I mentioned, the expert panel came out with the consolidated advice note, which all of a sudden changed the state of play. Lower rise buildings were coming into risk. Lower rise buildings were getting assigned a zero value because people didn't understand the extent of the cladding issue. And the problems that have transpired is that, including some lenders are requesting EWS1 forms for buildings that are out with the form scope. So the solution is unfortunately very much still work in progress, and us and our industry partners and government are looking very hard at this just now.
Okay, thank you, Craig. Next one, when you talk about energy retrofits, what type of work are you talking about? Is this only HVAC?
No. So it's not unusual to hear the term retrofit for services. Services and buildings, when they're upgraded, you usually understand this as a retrofit. But energy retrofit covers anything that could improve the energy efficiency of your building. So the starting point is generally the energy audits. You'd hire an experienced auditor with competence in understanding energy use to come and do a sort of initial audit of your building to understand where the potential for improvements are. So for jointly owned properties, for example, RERA just now is requiring that you do an audit. I think is part of your service charge review, and that identifies the potential for energy saving. But it doesn't need to be a jointly owned property. You can do this in your villa, you can do this in your office, you can do this in your warehouse, and there's sort of 3 levels of survey. You can do a quick walkthrough just to identify the basic stuff that you can improve, a sort of more detailed survey, or what they call a full audit, and that sets out in very fine detail how much you can potentially save, what measures you can put in, how difficult it's going to be to do these retrofit measures. For a larger building, that might mean just fitting lighting controls, fitting energy efficient lights, turning off AC in stairwells, for example, putting the AC off at night, basic steps like that. I mean, I've heard stories about those kind of measures accounting for a 20% in energy saving. For a tower, that's a huge amount of money.
Wow.
HVAC itself, I mean, that counts for about 60% of the electrical load in Dubai. So you can see why insulating walls as well as just changing lights and whatnot is definitely an attractive option. But that comes down to a cost-benefit analysis. What's the cost of fitting insulation on the roof, for example? Do I have to move services? How do I access that? And that those kind of deep retrofits definitely need a lot more thought. So hopefully that makes sense.
Okay, I have one more. They're asking which property in Dubai still has cladding. So I guess the question is, are there many properties in Dubai that still has cladding? And is there a list maybe that the government provides of these buildings?
I haven't seen a list, to be honest. So even again, to give the comparison with the UK, they were a bit concerned about releasing the list of individual building types, just in case people for some reason wanted to deliberately set a fire. You just never know. So I think it would be wise if there was a list for the government. I'm sure they probably do know, but not to reveal exactly what towers that is for obvious reasons. That's why it maybe needs to be assessed on a building by building basis. In terms of the amount of buildings, I mean, I guess potentially it's any building before 2012, especially the buildings during the crash, because the combustible cladding types is a lot less expensive than other types at that point. So if you're trying to save money, you maybe fit a less expensive cladding type that unfortunately, as we're finding it now, is more combustible. So I don't think, as far to my knowledge anyway, I'd be gratefully be corrected on that if there is a list, but I don't think there is a list defining exactly which towers or which lower rise buildings have the issue.
Yeah, it makes sense. Okay, Craig, thank you. Craig will be with us for the Q&A at the end of the presentation as well. If you have any questions for him, you can ask them here in the question box. How soon can we see the regulations in the UK translate into the UAE market?
It just depends on what regulations we're talking about. Obviously, there's different. There's the building regulations. Those will be different, I think, for the foreseeable future. The UK and the UAE just, they legislate these things in different ways. Generally when we've looked at things in the past, for example, building information modelling, you look at the time it takes from something to be implemented in the UK or the US and how long that's maybe taken to trickle down into the UAE. You can be talking 5 years plus. But I think with this kind of thing where you have an imminent risk to life, if we're talking about cladding, for example, then it's going to be far faster. But like I say, it's going to take that changes to that, I think, will take a catalyst in the UAE. It's going to be a very expensive process to remediate buildings if that's the way that the UAE decides to go. Look at the size of the fund that the UK's had to apportion to that, and if we are looking at facing a bit of an economic hardship, that's going to be a very difficult thing to fund. So I mean, that, I apologise, a bit of a loose answer to that question, whoever asked it, but it depends very much on what regulations we're talking about and the sort of, the risk profile that the UAE is looking at.
Sure. Now this leads to the next question. How much does it cost to replace cladding in the UAE?
Well, there's a few different factors you've got to take into account. So again, the building size, obviously, the higher it is, the more difficult it is to replace, the more expensive it's going to be. How dense it is around about the site. If you're talking about a site that's surrounded by roads and towers, that is a very, very difficult thing to do. I think, from memory, we had a quote of around about 30 million dirhams for, I think it was a G+30, so not that big. I mean, only that's only 10 stories, 30 million dirhams or so, I think, from memory. And if you assume you've got maybe, let's say, 4 apartments per floor, it's 120 odd. You're talking about 250,000 odd per unit. A lot of money. Who's got that just lying around about to pay for cladding? And that assumes that everybody can pay. Otherwise, how do you pay for it on one of these taller buildings? There's a mechanism that's required for jointly owned property that reinforces, called the reserve fund, and this is a fund of money that all the owners should be paying into in the event that something happens, like your chiller breaks down or you need to replace key services in the building. There was an examination early on when this cladding issue became a thing. Is there going to be enough money in the reserve fund to pay for that? And that's not something that was generally saved up for. So it's a very difficult process to fund and to manage.
Yeah, wow, that's a lot. You surprised me with that figure. Okay, you mentioned as-built information. What is that and how do you get it?
So when you hear people referring to as-built documents, that's generally speaking the information that's handed over from the contractor or the consultant at the end of a job. So they've got their the drawings for the job, they've got a specification, bills of quantities, etc., etc. And generally speaking, throughout the project, that there's maybe little changes over time and things that the engineer or the architect or the contractor will pick up. And what is meant to happen is at the end of the project, all the drawings are updated. So when you finish the project, you hand over the as-built information, so information that shows exactly how the building is built. That's the theory. Now, the reality is that very rarely happens. Certainly when I was working in Dubai, what we'd find if we go to a building and you ask the owner or the manager or whoever the relevant person is for as-built information, you were lucky if you got a full set of drawings, and often you were lucky if they were probably the original tender drawings or something that varies a lot. So that's what I mean by as-built information. And in an ideal world, that would be a starting point. If you're concerned, like, we've got some kind of metal composite cladding on my building, is this combustible? You could refer back to the drawings and say, you know what, it's such and such a specification. The problem is, that might not be accurate. And the problem is that's assuming that it was fitted correctly, and you'd have obviously got to look behind the cladding to see if that's the case. So that's the kind of problems that you face when you look at combustible cladding issues.
Wow. Okay. So is technical due diligence an engineer's report?
Yeah, not necessarily. A lot of people, we used to call these kind of things, a lot of people refer to structural surveys and engineers' reports. I mean, generally speaking, whoever leads the sort of technical due diligence process in the UK, it's something that building surveyors often get involved in, and that's why I was involved in the publication of that technical due diligence document. And it's really, often, especially buildings are complex. Smaller buildings, you're probably looking at one person doing a report. It could well be an engineer, a structural engineer, or it could be an architect. It could be an architectural technologist. Somebody that understands, the technical components of the building. The more bigger and complex the building gets, then you're likely to have a multidiscipline team. So you could have services engineers, you could have environmental experts, you could have quantity surveyors costing out all the costs and whatnot. So yes and no, it is. You could look at it as an engineer's report, but think of it as a more encompassing document that really sets out the long-term costs and implications of the building that you're looking at.
Okay, I have one more question for you, and I'm very conscious of the time here. Can a buyer of an apartment request any document for fire safety from the seller? Is that happening?
No, I doubt it. Not, number one, because the as-built information just isn't there sometimes. So, when you look at what before the recent changes in jointly owned property and development laws came into place, what would an apartment owner, for example, have in the way of information about the building? Probably not that much. They'll have information about their unit, the unit size, and and so on. Their what do you call it? The sales and purchase agreement, but they're not going to have full details of the fire risk of the building. That's and I refer back to jointly owned property because that's generally where the problems are. But the building manager, the owners association manager, should have more information on the building, and if they don't, then they should certainly look into getting it to make sure that they're managing that risk properly. But in terms of getting that information from the seller, I couldn't see it, to be honest.